I thought my family was perfect, a loving husband, beautiful kids, and a life others envied. But one night, when the house was quiet, my son's gaze lingered on me longer than it should have. And the moment he spoke, "I know how you feel about me, Mom," my world shattered. What happened next turned my picture-perfect life into a nightmare I never imagined. To the outside world, my life was flawless. My name is Rebecca, and I'm a devoted wife to Daniel, my high school sweetheart, and a proud mother to two wonderful kids, my twin girls, Emma and Grace, and my son, Liam. We lived in a picturesque suburban home with a white picket fence and the kind of life others dream of. I had a thriving career as a graphic designer, a loving family, and friends who would swear I had it all. But beneath the surface of this perfect life, there was a storm brewing, a secret I was too ashamed to admit, even to myself. Liam, my eldest, wasn't Daniel's biological son. He was the result of a college mistake, a fleeting night I spent trying to drown my heartbreak before Daniel came back into my life. When we got married, Daniel accepted Liam as his own, and together, we built a family that seemed impenetrable. As Liam grew older, he became the kind of young man any mother would be proud of, strong, confident kind. But as he matured, I started noticing things I couldn't ignore. The way his broad shoulders filled the doorframe, the way his deep laughter echoed through the house, and the small moments when his eyes lingered on mine just a little too long. At first, I chalked it up to a mother's natural pride. After all, Liam was becoming an adult, and it was normal to admire how much he'd grown. But as the months passed, I couldn't ignore the flutter in my chest when he hugged me or the way my cheeks flushed at the sound of his voice. I hated myself for it. What kind of mother feels this way about her own son? I tried to bury those feelings, distract myself with work, and focus on my girls. But no matter how hard I tried, they kept resurfacing, haunting me in the quiet moments when no one was watching. I avoided Liam whenever I could, telling myself it was for the best. Yet deep down, I knew I was only delaying the inevitable. Because one night, when the rest of the world seemed asleep, everything changed. It all began with small, almost imperceptible shifts. Liam was spending more time at home, finding reasons to be around me, even when there was no need. At first, I thought nothing of it. He was my son, of course, he wanted to spend time with me. But then I noticed the lingering glances, the way his gaze seemed to trace over me when he thought I wasn't looking. I started catching him in moments that felt off. Like the time I walked into the kitchen late at night to find him standing by the counter, shirtless, his broad shoulders illuminated by the soft glow of the refrigerator light. He turned when he heard me, a slow smile curling his lips as if he'd been waiting for me. "Couldn't sleep, Mom?" he asked casually, his voice lower than usual, his eyes holding mine a moment too long. My heart raced in a way I couldn't explain, or didn't want to. It wasn't just his behavior that was changing. It was mine too. I found myself hyper-aware of his presence, my skin prickling when he entered the room, my breath catching when he stood too close. I hated myself for it, for the way my heart betrayed me with its frantic beats and the warmth that bloomed in my chest when he smiled at me. This wasn't normal. It couldn't be. I started to second-guess everything. Was I imagining it? Was I reading too much into his actions, projecting my own twisted thoughts onto him? But then there were the moments I couldn't ignore. The nights when he'd sit too close on the couch, his thigh brushing against mine, his arm draping casually over my shoulders, his touch lingering just a second too long. It felt deliberate, calculated, as though he was testing the waters, waiting for me to react. I tried to talk myself out of it, to convince myself that it was all in my head. After all, Liam was my son. He couldn't. But the way he looked at me sometimes, with a mix of curiosity and something darker, made me question everything. There was an intensity in his eyes that I couldn't ignore, a silent acknowledgement of something we both knew we shouldn't feel. The worst part was the loneliness. I couldn't talk to anyone about what I was feeling. Not Daniel, not my friends, not anyone. How could I admit that my own son's presence made my pulse race? That I felt things no mother should ever feel? I was trapped in my own mind, caught in a web of guilt and shame that grew tighter with every passing day. And then there were the secrets. Liam started keeping his phone close, his laughter cutting off abruptly whenever I walked into the room. He'd disappear for hours without explanation, only to return with a casual shrug when I asked where he'd been. It was as though he was playing a game, daring me to confront him, to acknowledge the unspoken tension that hung between us like a storm cloud ready to break. I tried to distract myself by throwing myself into work, taking on more projects than I could handle. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't escape the growing sense of dread, the feeling that something was coming. Something I wouldn't be able to stop. It was only a matter of time before the cracks in our carefully constructed lives began to show, before the weight of all the unspoken feelings between us came crashing down. And deep down I knew I wouldn't be able to hold the pieces together when it did. It was a Friday night when the line between mother and son blurred in a way I could never have imagined. Daniel was out of town on a work trip, and the girls were staying over at a friend's house. It was just Liam and me in the house, a rare occurrence that I had spent the entire day dreading and secretly anticipating. I told myself I would keep busy, find something to do that would put some distance between us. But when I came downstairs to grab a glass of wine, there he was, sprawled on the couch, watching TV. He looked up when he heard me, his lips curling into a lazy, inviting smile. "Hey, Mom, want to watch something with me?" I should have said no. I should have turned around and gone back upstairs, away from his piercing gaze and the way his deep voice seemed to reverberate through me. But instead I heard myself say, "Sure, honey," as I crossed the room and sat beside him. The couch suddenly felt smaller than I remembered, his proximity making my skin prickle with awareness. We sat in silence, the movie playing on the screen nothing more than background noise. My focus was entirely on him, on the solid warmth of his body, so close to mine, on the way his arm rested casually on the back of the couch, just inches from my shoulders. My breath hitched when I felt his fingers brush against me, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down my spine. "It's been nice having you home more," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I feel like we never get to spend time together anymore." I turned to look at him, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they were searching, as if he was trying to unravel the thoughts I was so desperately trying to hide. "You've been busy with work and school," I said, my voice strained, my attempt to keep the conversation light falling flat. "I guess that's just how things are when kids grow up." "Maybe," he said, leaning closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "But sometimes I feel like you're avoiding me." "Did I do something wrong, Mom?" His words hit me like a blow, the guilt I'd been carrying for months threatening to spill over. "No, Liam," I said quickly, too quickly. "Of course not. I've just had a lot on my plate lately." He studied me for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't have to lie to me, you know. I've noticed how things have changed between us. And I know why." I froze, my pulse roaring in my ears. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I mean," he said, his voice dropping to a husky murmur, "I've noticed the way you look at me, Mom. The way you try not to, but you can't help yourself. It's okay. You don't have to hide it from me." I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs, his words slicing through the carefully constructed wall I had built around myself. "Liam," I said, shaking my head, my voice trembling. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" he asked, leaning closer, his arm slipping from the back of the couch to rest lightly on my shoulders. The heat of his touch was overwhelming, and I couldn't bring myself to move away. "Because I don't think I am. I think you feel it too. This thing between us." "No," I said, but the words sounded hollow, unconvincing. My entire body was trembling, torn between the voice of reason screaming at me to stop this now, and the dark, primal part of me that wanted to give in to the forbidden pull between us. His hand moved, his fingers brushing against my arm in a slow, deliberate stroke. "You don't have to be afraid, Mom," he whispered, his breath warm against my skin. "We don't have to pretend anymore." I tried to pull away, but his arm tightened around me, holding me in place. His other hand came up to cup my cheek, tilting my face toward his. "Look at me," he said softly, and I couldn't resist. My eyes locked with his, and in that moment, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us in the stillness of the room. "I can't," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "This is wrong." "It doesn't have to be," he murmured, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "It's only wrong if we let it be." The words hung between us, heavy with meaning, as his lips hovered just inches from mine. And in that moment I knew this was the point of no return. "Let me know if this flows the way you envisioned, or if you'd like adjustments. If it's good, I'll move on to the climax and discovery section." The night everything changed was one I'll never forget. A night that started with quiet unease and ended with a discovery that would shatter the fragile facade of my life. Daniel was away for work, and the twins were at a friend's house for the night, leaving just Liam and me alone in the house. I told myself I would stay in my room, maybe read a book or catch up on work, but as the hours ticked by, I found myself restless, pacing the length of my bedroom like a caged animal. My thoughts were a tangled mess, filled with memories of the stolen glances and the lingering touches that had defined the past few months. I hated myself for it, for the way my heart raced whenever Liam was near, for the way his voice seemed to wrap around me like a caress. I hated myself for the way I couldn't stop thinking about him. Eventually, I gave in to my restlessness and headed downstairs, intending to pour myself a glass of wine and calm my nerves. But as I stepped into the dimly lit kitchen, I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Liam was there, seated at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up when he heard me, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and even, as if he had been waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment before stepping fully into the room. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I'd get something to drink." Without a word, he gestured to the bottle of whiskey on the table, pouring me a glass and sliding it across to me. I sat down across from him, the silence between us thick and charged. The amber liquid burned as I took a sip, but it was nothing compared to the fire that seemed to burn between us. "You've been avoiding me," he said finally, breaking the silence. His eyes were locked on mine, unflinching and intense. "I haven't," I lied, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew he didn't believe me. "Yes, you have," he said, leaning forward slightly. "And I think I know why." My heart pounded in my chest as I met his gaze, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. "Liam," I began, my voice trembling, "I don't know what you're talking about." He reached across the table then, his hand brushing against mine in a touch that was far too intimate, far too deliberate. "You do," he said softly. "You know exactly what I'm talking about." I pulled my hand away as if his touch had burned me, my entire body trembling with a mix of fear and something darker, something I didn't want to name. "This is ridiculous," I said, trying to sound firm but failing miserably. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" he asked, his voice low and steady, his eyes never leaving mine. "Because I've seen the way you look at me, Mom. I've felt it in the way you pull away like you're afraid of me. Or maybe afraid of yourself." My breath hitched, his words cutting through me like a blade. "You're wrong," I said, shaking my head, but my voice lacked conviction and we both knew it. "I'm not," he said, standing up and moving around the table until he was standing directly in front of me. "And you know I'm not." I tried to stand, to put some distance between us, but he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to cup my face. The warmth of his touch was overwhelming, and I couldn't bring myself to pull away. "Liam," I whispered, my voice breaking. "This is wrong." "Then tell me to stop," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you really think this is wrong, tell me to stop, and I will." I opened my mouth to speak, to say the words that would put an end to this madness, but nothing came out. My entire body was trembling, my heart racing as his thumb brushed against my cheek, his gaze burning into mine. And then, before I could stop it, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was tentative at first, as if he were giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. My resolve crumbled, and I found myself kissing him back, my hands tangling in his hair as the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate. It was as though a dam had broken, months of suppressed feelings and forbidden desires flooding to the surface in a tidal wave that neither of us could control. His hands were everywhere, sliding down my arms, gripping my waist, pulling me closer as though he couldn't get enough of me. I don't know how long we stayed like that, lost in each other, but when we finally broke apart, the reality of what we had just done hit me like a freight train. I stumbled back, my hand covering my mouth as tears welled in my eyes. "Oh my God," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What have we done?" "Don't do that," he said, his voice firm as he stepped toward me. "Don't regret this." "How can I not?" I cried, backing away from him. "This is wrong, Liam. This is so wrong." "It doesn't have to be," he said, his tone softening as he reached out to me. "We can figure this out, Mom. We don't have to hide from what we feel." "No," I said, shaking my head. "You don't understand. This will destroy us. It will destroy everything." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it was too late. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The weight of what we had done hung heavily between us, a dark, suffocating cloud that threatened to consume everything in its path. The days following that night were a blur of guilt, shame, and unbearable tension. I could barely look at myself in the mirror, let alone face Liam. Every time I saw him, I was flooded with memories of what we had done, the way his hands felt on me, the way his lips claimed mine as if he had every right to. It was wrong. Every fiber of my being screamed that it was wrong. But the guilt wasn't enough to erase the aching need I still felt whenever he was near. I avoided him as much as I could, throwing myself into work and finding excuses to stay out of the house. Grocery shopping, errands, late meetings, I invented any reason to keep my distance. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape him. The house seemed smaller now, suffocating, and every room was filled with the ghost of what had happened between us. Liam, on the other hand, didn't seem to share my desperation to forget. If anything, he seemed emboldened, finding ways to corner me, to force me to acknowledge what we'd done. His gaze lingered longer than it should, his touch lasting just a beat too long whenever we crossed paths. And the worst part, a part of me didn't want him to stop. One evening, I came home late, exhausted and hoping to slip into the house unnoticed. But as I walked through the door, I found him waiting for me in the living room, his arms crossed and an unreadable expression on his face. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've been busy," I replied, my voice shaky as I set my purse down and avoided his gaze. "Work has been hectic." "That's not the reason, and you know it," he said, stepping closer. "Why won't you talk to me, Mom?" I froze, my pulse quickening as he closed the distance between us. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happened was a mistake, Liam. It never should have happened, and it can't happen again." "Is that what you really think?" he asked, his tone softening as he reached out to touch my arm. "Because I don't believe you. I know you felt it too. I know you still feel it." I pulled away from him, my eyes stinging with tears. "You don't understand, Liam. This isn't just about how we feel. This will destroy our family. It will destroy everything. Maybe it's already destroyed," he said quietly, his words cutting through me like a knife. "Maybe it's been broken for a long time, and we're just pretending it's not." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I didn't know what to say, how to respond. He was right in some ways. My marriage to Daniel had become more of a routine than a relationship, and I had been going through the motions for years. But that didn't make what Liam and I had done any less wrong. "I can't do this," I whispered, shaking my head as tears streamed down my face. "I can't, Liam. Please, just let me go." He stepped back then, his expression pained but resigned. "I'll give you space," he said softly. "But I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen. And I'm not going to pretend I don't feel what I feel." I left the room without another word, retreating to the sanctuary of my bedroom, where I collapsed onto the bed and cried until I had no tears left. The weight of my guilt was crushing, and yet, beneath it all, there was a flicker of something else, something darker and more dangerous. Desire. No matter how much I hated myself for it, I couldn't deny that I still wanted him. The following days were a delicate balancing act, filled with forced smiles and awkward silences. Daniel returned from his trip, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had unraveled in his absence. I threw myself into my role as wife and mother, desperate to cling to the life I had built, even as it felt like it was crumbling beneath me. But the tension between Liam and me didn't go unnoticed. Daniel commented on it one evening as we sat together in the living room, watching a movie. "Is everything okay with Liam?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "He seems different lately." My heart raced as I forced a smile and shook my head. "He's just going through a phase," I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "You know how teenagers can be." Daniel nodded, seeming satisfied with my answer, but the guilt gnawed at me like a relentless tide. How long could I keep this secret? How long before the weight of what we had done came crashing down, destroying everything I had worked so hard to protect? I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing for certain. The fallout was inevitable. And when it came, I wasn't sure I would survive it. In the weeks that followed, the weight of what had happened between Liam and me hung over me like a storm cloud. Every glance, every accidental touch, every shared silence was a reminder of the line we had crossed, a line that could never be uncrossed. The guilt was suffocating, but what terrified me even more was the part of me that didn't regret it. That part, the dark and hidden corner of my soul, still yearned for him, still craved the forbidden connection that had turned my world upside down. I tried to bury myself in my roles as wife and mother, to find solace in the routines of daily life. I made breakfast, drove the twins to school, attended parent-teacher meetings, and smiled through social gatherings as if nothing had changed. But inside, I was crumbling, torn apart by the duality of who I had become. On the surface, I was Rebecca, the perfect wife, the devoted mother, the woman who had it all together. But underneath, I was something else entirely, a woman haunted by her choices, consumed by desires she could never speak of. Liam, for his part, seemed to sense my struggle. He kept his distance, giving me the space I so desperately needed, but his presence was always there, lingering on the edges of my awareness. And despite everything, I couldn't help but steal glances at him, couldn't stop the way my heart raced whenever he entered the room. It was a constant battle between what I knew was right and what I couldn't seem to let go of. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, Liam walked in, his expression hesitant but determined. "Mom," he said softly, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, my pulse quickening as I nodded. "Of course," I said, though my voice was barely above a whisper. He sat down across from me, his eyes meeting mine with a vulnerability that took my breath away. "I know this has been hard for you," he said. "It's been hard for me too. But I don't want you to hate yourself because of this. What happened, it doesn't define who you are." I swallowed hard, tears welling in my eyes as his words cut through the layers of shame and self-loathing I had built around myself. "I don't know how to move past this, Liam," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to forgive myself." "You don't have to figure it out all at once," he said gently. "But you can't keep carrying this weight alone. It'll destroy you." His words hit me like a lifeline, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to break down completely. The tears came in an uncontrollable flood, and Liam moved to sit beside me, wrapping his arms around me in a hug that felt both comforting and suffocating. I cried into his shoulder, the weight of everything pouring out of me as he held me, murmuring words of reassurance that I wasn't sure I deserved. When the tears finally subsided, I pulled away, wiping my face with shaking hands. "I don't know what to do," I whispered. "But I know this can't happen again. We have to find a way to move forward." He nodded, his expression solemn. "I understand, and I'll do whatever it takes to help you." In the days that followed, I began taking small steps toward healing. I sought therapy, though I couldn't bring myself to share the full truth of what had happened. Instead, I spoke of guilt and shame in abstract terms, trying to piece together the fractured parts of myself without revealing the depth of my secrets. Through it all, I held on to one hard-earned truth. I had made a terrible mistake, one that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But that mistake didn't have to define me. It didn't have to dictate the rest of my story. Slowly, I began to rebuild the boundaries that had been shattered. I reconnected with Daniel, throwing myself into our marriage in an attempt to mend what had been broken. It wasn't easy. Some days it felt impossible, but I clung to the hope that redemption was still possible, even for someone like me. And as for Liam, I knew our relationship would never be the same. But I also knew that if I ever hoped to heal, I would have to let him go. Not just as a son, but as the person I had allowed myself to see in a way I never should have. It was a painful realization, but it was the only way forward. In the end, the lesson was clear. Temptation can destroy everything you've built in a single moment. And while forgiveness, of yourself, of others, can take a lifetime, it's the only way to truly move on. No matter how far you fall, there's always a choice to rise again. If you were in her position, what would you do? Could you ever move past such a forbidden mistake? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you want more shocking, heart-wrenching stories like this one, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, the next story will leave you speechless. Stay tuned.